The way we lead impacts the way people live. This world needs, truly, human leadership.
Quite often we think that we have to do big things to make a significant difference, but often it's the smallest thing. It's like a pebble in the pond, and the ripples can go out and go far. And that is what it means to care. You know, we can throw that pebble in the pond and the ripple effect can go on way, way beyond what we could ever imagine and hope for.
I'm Brent Stewart, your host. Thanks for listening. This podcast is an outreach of Barry-Wehmiller. You can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller, and find our podcasts, articles, and videos at trulyhumanleadership.com. Peter Docker served for 25 years as a Royal Air Force senior officer. He's been a force commander during combat flying operations and seen service across the globe. His career has spanned from professional pilot to leading an aviation training and standards organization, teaching postgraduates at the UK's Defence College, to flying the Prime Minister around the world. He also served as a crisis manager and former international negotiator for the UK government. Now, you may recognize Peter from his work with our friend Simon Sinek. You know the book Find Your Why, A Practical Guide for Discovering Purpose for You and Your Team? Well, that was written by Simon, Peter, and David Mead, who you might remember from a recent episode of the podcast. In December 2019, Peter stepped away from Simon's team to focus on sharing his wider insights into how organizations thrive. And he just released a new book, Leading from the Jumpseat: How to Create Extraordinary Opportunities by Handing Over Control. Peter recently appeared on a webinar sponsored by Chapman & Co. Leadership Institute, Barry-Wehmiller's external consulting arm, who helps companies around the globe implement the principles of truly human leadership. You can learn more about what they do at ccoleadership.com. Sarah Hanna, CCO's managing partner, interviewed Peter for this event, and we're going to bring it to you now in an edited form. And to start things off, Sarah asked Peter why he decided to call his book Leading from the Jumpseat. What is a jump seat? And what does that have to do with leadership?
The jump seat is the seat that is immediately behind the two pilot seats on large passenger jets. You know, you have the captain and the co-pilots, and then you often have this third seat, the jump seat. And it's usually empty, but crew members can catch a ride back home on that seat. That's perfectly permissible. But whilst you're sat there, you can actually reach out and touch the two pilots. You're that close. And the name or notion of leading from the jump seat came from a story of an experience I had after just qualifying a aircraft captain, and me being sat in that seat, and just after takeoff we had an emergency. The notion of leading from the jump seat, it's all about lifting others up, giving them the space so they can step up and lead. And for me, this is the highest form of leadership, because it's not about retaining or growing your own power. It's about empowering others. At the end of the day, when we're working on things which we feel are really important to us, you know, at some stage, we are going to step back. You know, if we're the CEO of the company, we're going to retire, perhaps. If we're leading a team, we're going to step back from that team, change jobs. Or even as a parent, you know, our kids grow up eventually, leave home and start to lead their own lives. So it's inevitable that at some stage, we're going to hand over control. And leading from the jump seat is all about recognizing that and leading in such a way with such intention that we're preparing people to lead and to take forward those things that we feel are really important to us.
You know that the phrase kind of lifting people up is kind of part of your core purpose, how you've kind of filtered and made decisions about the work that you do. Can you talk more about where that comes from, why that's important to you?
Yeah, I think, well, actually, it's quite difficult to say exactly the reason I feel that way, but I know it's part of who I am, because whenever I see anybody excelling or exceeding their own or other people's expectation, it just completely fills me up. Oh, it's quite ridiculous, frankly, Sarah. I can be watching the Olympics, and I don't know the athletes from Adam, but when I see the relief and the joy on their face when they cross the finish line or clear the bar in high jump or whatever, I'm right there with them, and I kind of well up. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that some of my favorite films reflect that. Hidden Figures is one, which follows the early days of the American space program, and celebrates the brilliance of three women who at the time were not treated perhaps as they should have been. So, that is one of my favorite films. Apollo 13, there's great leadership lessons from there, from that film. But again, it's people being extraordinary in what they do. And that really gets me right here. So because of that, what I do in life, I have the great privilege and honor to help people often get out of their own way and excel in ways that perhaps they couldn't previously imagine. But it's all about them. It's about what they're great at, what fills their heart. And just being able to unlock that is what fills me with joy.
Well, I like the fact that now I found out that you also tear up at the Olympics. And if I'm being honest, the commercials too, right? Because the marketers are all over that one. A lot of the stories in Leading from the Jump Seat center on your career as a commander in the Royal Air Force. Can you talk about you make a myriad of decisions when you're in that type of a role, but can you talk about perhaps the leadership decision that you made that perhaps upon reflection you would redo? Something that you decided that if you could go back and rewrite the script, that you would actually make a different decision.
Yes, I can actually. And first off, the military side of it, a lot of the stories in the book, as you say, there's quite a few about the military, quite a few of situations I've faced, the emergency crisis situations on aeroplanes. And it makes a good story. But the point of telling those stories is because it brings out lessons that show how people behave when they're at the extreme of human existence. And in my experience, that's when you see people's true colors. So the lessons we learn in those situations can help us in everyday life, where hopefully our lives are not on the line, because people are still people. But coming back to your question, one big time I made a decision that, I don't regret as such, because I learned something from it, but it was when I took over my squadron. The squadron is the main fighting unit of the Royal Air Force and most other air forces in the world. And it's a huge privilege to be given command of a squadron. I mean, the one I had, 101 Squadron, dated back to 1917. And you've got all that history and legacy to carry forward. But at the time when I took over that squadron, I took over from a guy called Ian, who was a brilliant, and still is a brilliant guy. He had huge charisma. He was great at his job. Everybody loved him. And the squadron seemed to be doing great. And somewhere in the deep recess of my mind, I figured out that in order for me to be successful, I needed to mirror Ian. But of course, as you would imagine, that didn't really work out terribly well, because it wasn't who I am. And even if others can't put that into words, who you're being, if it doesn't feel right to other people, then not only is it awkward, it starts to break down other things, particularly trust. And many people who had known me when I was a more junior officer and before I took over the squadron, they knew who I was. In other words, they knew how I showed up. And then they didn't recognize this guy who'd taken over the squadron that had my name, because I wasn't being who I truly was. So, that wasn't a great decision of mine. It took me about 6 months to figure out, be yourself, because everybody else is taken, as someone once said. And once I started to relax into that, then I started to rebuild the trust, and things started to go much better. Do I regret it? Well, at the time, I think that was, I could have done better. But, we learn from these things, don't we? And I think that's the important thing about leadership. It's not about getting it right, whatever right looks like. It's not about getting it right all of the time. What's really important is your intention. Are you sorting yourself from the right place? Are you in service of your people? And also it's the trend over time. We'll all have a few glitches along the way, but if your intention and the trend is heading in the right direction, you're okay. We're all human. We do.
Chronically so.
Absolutely. So, yeah.
One of the kind of core concepts of the book is this idea of a stand versus a position, and how important it is, both from a personal standpoint of kind of literally what do I stand for, but also because of how it impacts people. Can you kind of explain the difference between the two, or give us an example of a stand versus a position?
Yeah, certainly. There are quite a few distinctions in language that I use in the book, because when we have distinctions in language, it helps us to have different conversations, and then we can get different results. And stand and position is one of the distinctions I've picked up over my years. And it's very easy. A position is against something, a stand is for something. So let's dig into that a little bit. The best example, actually, is we've got very narrow streets. We live in the countryside here in England, and there's a narrow road that leads through the fields to our village. And there's only really enough space for one vehicle going in each direction. So sometimes you'll get two vehicles and they'll touch, almost bumper to bumper. And quite often those drivers will take up a position against the other person. And that looks like, well, you were driving too fast. My journey is more important than yours. You should reverse back to the passing place, And what happens with positions, we get more and more entrenched in those positions. But then every so often, one of those people in that sort of confrontation immediately reverses up to the passing place, because that person, she has got a stand, and that stand is for being courteous on the road. And the really interesting thing is that as soon as she reverses up because of her stand, the position the other guy had immediately dissolves, because a position can only exist when there's a counter position. But what happens to the lady's stand? That actually is intensified. It becomes more of her foundation as she practices it, and it doesn't depend on anyone or anything else to exist. And the reason the position and stand thing is so important is that in terms of leadership, particularly when we're leading in unfamiliar territory or in a crisis, having very clear understanding of what we stand for, and there could be many things that we stand for, but having a clear understanding of that, it gives us the guide rail, the handrail that we need to figure out which direction to go in when we're in unfamiliar territory and to lead better. So that's the position and the stand distinction, but really important.
I have a couple of questions on that, both from the side of the person who's making the position and the person who's making the stand. What prevents us from shifting from position to stand, other than just not thinking that way? But what are the kind of underlying emotional qualities that prevent us or lock us into our position?
Everything that's important to us in life is driven by one of two things. It's driven by either fear or it's driven by love. Now, as soon as I mention the love word, people in business say, recoil a bit, but I'll come back to that. What fear looks like, how fear shows up in our lives is, often ego, when the pressure's on, or in the example of my two cars, stopping bumper to bumper, the ego of it's all about me. I think ego is Greek for I. Or we discount other people. Anger comes into fear as well. Or we see the world as a place of scarcity. Or we could go the other way, timidity. The thing with fear is that fear is triggered in us when our life, our livelihood, our status or reputation is threatened. Fear can be good. If we're about to step out to the road and we suddenly see a car, that fear will have us react and probably save our life. But fear can get in the way when it's actually our livelihood, status, or reputation that is the trigger. But then we have love. And when we're sourcing ourselves from love, we have a view of the world of opportunity and possibility, of hope. We have a view of the world where we're in service of others. It's not about me. Instead of ego, we have what I call humble confidence, where we have the humility to listen to other people, and yet we're confident in being decisive and being focused on perhaps our stand, our commitment, where we're going. And the thing that is interesting between love and fear is that we have a choice. We always have a choice as to where we're going to source ourselves from. We can source ourselves from fear, as in the person taking up the position of you get out of my way, or we can choose to source ourselves from love, from a stand in what we believe in. And what joins these things is courage. Yeah, courage can't exist without fear, but courage can only be sustained by love. And, let's take it to one of those extreme situations, an emergency in an aeroplane or taking people into combat. Anybody who's not fearful in those situations, well, you probably need your head looking out a little bit. But it generates the courage, and people continue to, in these cases of a combat situation, put themselves in harm's way for the love of the people around them. Yeah, that's what has them move forward. Not fear, it's love. It's the same with the terrible photographs and video we see of typically women clutching their young child as they escape some war-torn area like Syria. The fear of what might happen if they stay triggers them, but then they find the courage and the love of their child to step into the unknown and flee to hopefully safer areas, So this is key. This is what drives, if we allow it, if we choose, we can be driven by love. And that is much more generative than fear. So that's the emotional side of it.
Yeah. Can you give maybe an example of, from a leadership perspective, how either you or that you've observed somebody taking a stand that allowed people to move from fear to love? So if I'm in a situation in which both are present and I'm leading, I'm in that leadership seat, and I need this group to move from one scenario to the other, how does taking a stand help others?
Well, the example that immediately comes to mind, Sarah, is when I was a commander during the Iraq War 2003. I had 200 people under my care. We're out in Saudi, and our job, we flew, it wasn't very exciting in some ways, it wasn't a punchy aeroplane. We flew a big aircraft about the size of a 737, full of fuel, gas, to give away. We're air refuelers, so we gave away that fuel to fighter jets in the air. And we were undefended, we didn't have weapons, and anti-aircraft fire used to shoot at us from the ground, which, was a bit irritating after a while, but thankfully they didn't hit us very often. And so, yeah, we were fearful, I'm sure, but I was their leader. And this is where a distinction I picked up from Seth Godin, actually, which was a huge relief when I heard about it, because it filled in a missing piece of my jigsaw. And that was the difference between being authentic and having integrity. We hear a lot, particularly in companies and leadership conversations, about being authentic. But as Seth says, you lose the right to be authentic when you're about 4 years old. A 4-year-old child is authentic, screaming because they're hungry or something hurts or they want attention. Yeah. But later on, we need to put a filter there. And it's particularly the case when you're in a role of leadership. You have that senior position where people are expecting you to lead. I could have been absolutely authentic and shared my fears, concerns, apprehensions with the rest of my team, but that wouldn't have been in service of them. I had to have the integrity of the role that I'd been given, and that meant putting a filter on. So this comes to your question, Sarah, because I had to have that integrity to share with my people a stand. And that stand was I needed everyone from the aircraft technicians to the aircraft pilots and crew to do their job, because people were relying on the fuel that they would give to the fighter jets. And the reason they were relying on the fighter jets getting their fuel was people who wore British, American, Australian uniforms on the ground in Iraq were relying on the air support that we could give them. And if we didn't give them that air support, they would likely die. So in very simple words, very similar to that, that's what I told my people, because they needed a clear signal out of all the noise of what was going on, all the politics and the newspapers. They needed a clear signal of, what are we doing here? What can we latch onto? What's our stand? And I didn't have that language back then. But by luck, perhaps more than judgment, I gave them that stand. And because it came genuinely from me, and they believed me, then that gave them the energy, the stand that they could feed off too. So as you know, Sarah, anything really to do with leadership all starts right here. But that's the example that comes to mind for me on that.
You mentioned that might be what we say or what we articulate. I'm going to give everybody kind of a reason for being in this moment. We talked about kind of perhaps what makes that difficult internally, and you mentioned the phrase humble confidence. So it's not just that I am taking a stand, it's also this idea that I do it in a particular way that draws people to me, and not, as a position does, distance me from others. Can you talk about kind of how you define humble confidence? How does one acquire it? Where does it come from? Why is that concept important?
So one of the biggest things for me with humble confidence is the willingness to listen. Quite often we have this idea in our mind that to lead successfully, we need to have the answer. But actually, if your leadership depends on you knowing the answer, you become the constriction in the pipe. Your team can only advance as fast as you do. However, if you become comfortable with leading when you don't know the answer, and instead creating the space where others can step up to help you figure it out, then you're more likely to accelerate your team forward much further and much faster than you otherwise would. So listening is a really key concept of humble confidence. But very quickly, a great example of humble confidence in action for me was shortly after my 25th birthday, and I was a first officer, a co-pilot flying these passenger jets, and we'd flown down to Nairobi in Kenya, and we made our approach around about 7 o'clock in the morning, and a few miles from touchdown, we put the wheels down, as you do on aircraft, about 8 miles from touchdown, and the wheels take about 30 seconds to come down, and you get 3 green lights when they're locked down in the landing position. And we got a green light for the nose wheel, a green light for the right-hand wheel, but a red light remains for the left-hand wheel, which meant that the left-hand wheel had not come down. Long story short, we spent about 2.5 hours with the excess fuel we had trying to get this wheel down, and it did not want to come down. All of the fail-safe drills that we had, it did not work. So we were faced with briefing the 140 passengers that we were going to have to crash land, which, as you can imagine, they were thrilled about. We weren't too mad about it either. But in this moment, when we tried everything, the captain, Tony Webb, he was an experienced captain, and he led with humble confidence. He turned to me and he said, "Peter, I want you to fly the crash landing." Now, anybody who doesn't know the wider context of that would think, well, hang on, wasn't the captain abdicating his responsibility? Was he unsure? Was he timid? Was he afraid? No, none of that. The wider context was that while Tony was a very experienced captain, he wasn't that experienced on that aircraft type. I, on the other hand, had got thousands of hours on that aeroplane, that particular type. I was also, at the time, at the top of my game. I was one of the few pilots who flew our Prime Minister around, the British equivalent of Air Force One. And also, as it happens, 2 weeks prior, I'd been in the simulator practicing crash landings. So it was a very good choice to make. But it took humble confidence, because humble confidence is not about being timid. He had listened to all the input, we tried everything we could, and then he thought, right, well, Peter is best equipped to fly. I'm now going to support Peter to do that job, because he was driven from the love of his stand, which was to take care of everybody on that aircraft. And what is the best chance we have of walking away from this? And so, he wasn't timid at all. He was decisive and he was resolute. And he gave me the support I needed to fly that approach. And by the way, our respect for Tony after went through the roof, because that was a big call.
So are you going to leave us hanging, or what happened?
Oh, right. So, so
you're here. So I guess it worked out.
It worked out. So we flew the approach, or I flew the approach, and about 45 seconds from touchdown, there was a clunk. And for an unknown reason, we don't know to this day, we got a green light, and that wheel under the left wing came down and locked in position. And I made one of the smoothest landings I think I've ever made. And then we went to the bar. Yes. But so it worked out. But that for me is a great example of humble confidence, because it would have been so easy for ego to have kicked in. And for Tony to say, well, I'm going to do this. And everybody around him would have known, you're not the best person to be doing this, probably. So
I would imagine expectation, right? Like when we carry a particular title or a role, it's one of the things that gets in the way is that people expect me to be the one to make the tough call, or expect me to be the one to do the crash landing. And yes, ego, but also perhaps something that is my perception that's not really true.
Yeah. Perceptions are a great thing, aren't they? And I think having a very clear understanding of what we stand for, in this case, getting everybody on the ground safely, that's going back to an earlier part of our conversation, Sarah, that is the important handrail that we need in those times, because it gives us the clarity of thought that we need to make the best decisions we can in the moment, particularly in times of crisis or in situations which are new to us. So, it all comes back to the stand.
What would you say to people who kind of are having difficulty translating from in a cockpit, the roles are very clearly defined. You have titles like captain and what have you. If you're in an environment that either you're not the leader or it's just murky at best, how do these principles apply, and how so?
Absolutely. The book, it's a how-to book, so in the same way as I share a lot of stories from my background, the stories are there for a purpose, to bring out a leadership theme or idea. But similarly, I recognize that people are going to be different stages of their life careers. So I've taken the flying metaphor on a little bit. And the reason why flying is, in my view, a really good metaphor is because the flight deck of an aircraft is like a microcosm of leadership. You get some of the best leadership I've ever seen, and frankly, you can get some pretty poor leadership too. So it's quite a good vehicle to share these leadership ideas. But at the end of each main chapter in the book, I've shared some things for us to consider in terms of how to put into action the ideas that I've shared in that chapter. And I break it down into 4 sections. The first is learning to fly. The second is flying. And then we've got teaching others to fly. And finally, leading from the jump seat. So first of all, learning to fly, that would be very much perhaps people at earlier stages in their life where they're trying to figure out what's really, really important to them, what's really important in life. And for some of us, that comes fairly early on. For others, it takes quite a few more years. But until we're really clear on what's important to us, then it's difficult to identify what our stands are and what commitments we're going to make. And therefore, it's more difficult to lead others. But most of us will get there. But then we move on to the next stage, flying. And that is the equivalent perhaps of you're really good at a particular job. You've been hired by a company to do that job. And flying is when you're in flow, you're really good at that and you're thriving in it. And you're practicing what you stand for, you're practicing your skills. But then we will probably get promoted if we're really good. And then we are into the stage of what I refer to teaching others to fly, where we're not just, well, chances are we're not focused on doing computer programming, if that was our original job. We're now looking after the people who are doing that role. And we need to teach them to fly and start to lift them up. The focus shifts from ourselves more to other people. But then eventually we will get to the stage where, we're very senior in the company, or we're taking a big step back. I'll be talking to a CEO of a company in a couple of weeks who is retiring from his company. We all leave at some stage, but that's when we are leading from the jump seat, and when we can bring together all of these ideas. Mm-hmm. The kicker, or the interesting thing for me, is when I was writing this, I suddenly realized, we're not all on this linear track. In some areas in our life, we might be teaching others to fly, but in other areas of life, we might still be learning to fly ourselves. A great leader I worked with, Sir James Dutton, Lieutenant General Sir James Dutton, KCB, CB, but very, very senior military guy and former governor for the Queen to Gibraltar, the country of Gibraltar. I worked with him 20 plus years ago, and he lifted other people up, and he was very much in the mode of lead from the jump seat. But over the last few months, I've been working with him as he's transitioning to becoming a speaker. And so he's learning to fly again, and he's that senior. So we're on different tracks in different parts of our lives. So there's things that we can put into practice around leading from the jump seat, no matter where we are on those tracks in life.
Well, I think one of the arenas in which people, myself included, are perpetually learning to fly is in parenthood. So for those of us who have children, you tell some stories in the book. Certainly, could you give us an example of where you've taken some of this into your parenting journey, in particular around the concept of shifting the context, which is another kind of skill set that's in the book. How do we do that for our kids? How do we perhaps reframe how they see some situations?
Yeah, well, context is everything. Like fear and love, I like things in twos. There's context and content. Content is like all the jigsaw puzzle pieces on the table, and that represents the work we do, the things that we say, what we're engaged in. But then context is like the picture on the box. Of the jigsaw puzzle, and we need that picture so you can see all those puzzle pieces coming together. And so as leaders, we really need to focus on that context. And sometimes we need to turn over the puzzle pieces to find a different picture on the other side, and we can turn over the puzzle box and there's a different picture, and the puzzle pieces come together, but they have a different meaning. So that's shifting the context. And one story that comes to mind in answer to your question, Sarah, is when my son Patrick, he became 18, and in the UK, when you get to the age of 18, you can graduate from riding a small little moped motorbike to a big bike. And Patrick wanted a big bike. He wanted a Suzuki Bandit that would go from 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds and do over
every parent's dream, right?
Oh, now it's risky in many countries, but round here where the streets are narrow and twisty, one of Patrick's friends had almost lost his life, a few years earlier. So yeah, we were concerned. And my initial context came from fear. And also I immediately in my head went to a position which was, no way are you going to do that, was what was in my head. But if I'd gone down that path, it's very likely that Patrick would have taken up a counter position, which was, I am going to do this. I'm 18, whether you like it or not. I want to get out and see my friends, and this gives me mobility and all the rest of it. So I shifted the context. And actually, it was sourced from this side, from the love side. I thought, well, what's the underlying commitment around this position that's coming into my head? My underlying commitment was for Patrick being safe. That's what was driving me. So I chose to lead with that. And I said to Patrick, look, what we'll do is you can get this bike. In fact, I've seen one on the market secondhand. We'll buy it. Okay. And sit in the shed until we're ready. I said, and you'll go through all the training and I'll come and do that training with you. But we won't just do the basic training. We'll go on and do the advanced rider training that you can do in this country and become an advanced rider. And we'll do that together too. And Patrick probably thought, you know what? Being an advanced rider, that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah.
Not a bad deal.
So we set off, well, and me too, yeah. But we set off down that path, and it's quite lengthy training. And some way into it, Patrick came to me and said, you know what? He said, I've had to think about this. By the time I've paid for the insurance and everything else, the cost of this bike, I'm not going to be able to put fuel in it and go anywhere. He said, so I'm going to get a car instead. So this is a real example of quite a tough leadership challenge, which could have had one predictable outcome if I'd led with a position. But instead, I shifted the context and led from a place of a stand. And lots of possibilities emerged there. Yes, we had good fun on the training that we did, but it brought us closer together. You know, we created opportunities that perhaps wouldn't have been there otherwise. Yeah. And it's exactly the same in business and in a team and, well, crisis situations too.
One question that's come through is around kind of this idea that in that story that you just told, there's a little bit of inherent risk, right? You still might get the bike and you still might, now you've been trained, we've agreed that we're going to be safe, but perhaps still an accident happens, right? That it ends up where you thought it would in the very beginning. In leadership, it could look like, I feel like I've trained you. I feel like I'm ready to give up control. But a mistake happens. It doesn't go so well. What's the advice, the guidance for leaders who are like, man, I'm teetering on that edge of, do I let you go down this path when it might end up that you weren't ready? Did everything I could, prepped you, you're trained, but it actually might not end up the way that you want.
That makes me think, Sarah, of, it's another story in the book, because we remember stories, don't we? But there was a time, and this is a flying story again, and I was the captain of the aircraft. I had a pilot, a co-pilot, who was fine. He was fully trained, but he wasn't that experienced. And we were flying this approach into Gander in Newfoundland, and the weather can be a little bit, well, not great, to be honest. And when you're flying an approach to many large airports, you have what are called precision approach indicators. And these are 4 lights on one side or either side of the runway, and they can show either red or they can show white. And the idea is for you to see 2 red lights and 2 white lights, because that tells you that you're on the correct approach slope to land safely. If you see 3 white lights, you're going too high. If you see 3 red lights, you're going too low. If you see 4 red lights, you're way too low, and it's dangerous. And the chap in question was flying the approach, and we started off with 2 red lights and 2 white lights, all good on the correct approach path. But then we got 3 red lights, not so good, going low. So I called out to him. I said, we're going low on the approach. And he acknowledged, but he didn't take the corrective action, which was to put a bit more power on from the engines, which slows your rate of descent down and would put us back on the correct approach path. But I let him continue because it wasn't dangerous at that point. But then we got to the point where we saw 4 red lights. Now, we're still a long way back. We're still safe. But it's getting to the point where if I allowed it to go any further, using all my skill that I had, I wouldn't have been able to recover the situation. But even then, I didn't take over. Because if I had, I'd have burst his balloon of confidence, and that's a very difficult thing to get back. So I called it out again. He didn't take corrective action, and I just nudged the throttles forward, and we got back to the state where we saw 2 red lights and 2 white. And, you know, we landed safely. We had to talk about it afterwards, and all was good. So the point of this story is whenever we're facing these situations, we need to know what is your 4 red light moment? When do you reach that point where if you allow the other person to continue, you are not going to be able to recover the situation safely? And I give quite a lot of guidance in the book about this because it's a really important point. You know, well, the first thing to ask yourself is, does it matter? Because often it doesn't matter, in which case, let the person continue. You can talk about it afterwards and, they'll learn from it. Yes, because we all learn from our mistakes, or we have the opportunity to. But, if it's going to really threaten our lives, or it's going to threaten other people, or bring our company down, we need to know what that 4 red light moment is so as we can step in, because at that point, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, which I think is Spock, isn't it, from Star Trek? But either way, it's true, and that's where we need to be clear on what we stand for, what's guiding us, that handrail, just like Tony Webb recognized that it wasn't him that was important on that aircraft where we can get the wheels down. It was the safety of all the 145 people on board, So that's why knowing what our stands are is so important, and knowing what our 4 red light moments is so important too.
I wonder, we've talked a lot about a variety of different concepts. Could you give us what are 3 kind of specific action items that anybody could do tomorrow? Like if you're like, okay, conceptually I understand, I want to shift perhaps to more leading from the jump seat. What are kind of 3 tactical things that people could do tomorrow to make some progress?
Yep. Sure. So the first thing is, it all comes down to the person in the mirror, doesn't it? And the first thing is to reflect a little bit. I know people don't like to reflect because we like to get on and get into action, don't we? But it comes down to figuring out what's really, really important to you. A quick example on this: 2 years ago, I had a phone call from my wife, and she'd been in a car accident. Thankfully, she was okay, but she needed my help. Now, nothing would have got in my way to leaving the house and driving to go and help her. It was only a couple of miles down the road, but nothing would have got in my way. Why? Because family is really important to me. And that is something that's really important to many people. What I find interesting is the fire that ignites inside you. Because when you're connected to what's really, really important to you, there is nothing that's going to get in your way. And as you'll read in the book, other things that are really important to me, which came to light as I went through my early life, was not being dependent on others. By that, I mean not holding other people back or needing to call on them, being a burden to people. That was one of my things that drives me, something that's really important. Another is the notion of mutual respect. And again, as you'll read in the book, that made understanding that, becoming aware of that, had me take a very different path, had me leave university mid-course. Yeah, so figuring out what's really, really important to you is the starting point, because that is the foundation of everything else. We can practice humble confidence as well. We can practice humble confidence by listening and making sure we keep that ego thing in check, and being willing to allow others to come up with a solution or an answer to a challenge we're facing. And that can apply if we're running a big team, a small team, or just at home with our kids. It applies everywhere. So practice switching humble confidence for ego. Being willing to listen, but also remaining decisive and focused on the reason that you're trying to do whatever it is you're trying to do as a team or a group. Letting go of the notion of you've always got to have the answer. And then perhaps a third thing is based around one of the other key themes of the book, which is nurturing a sense of belonging. This is absolutely key in a team if we want people to step up and take responsibility for things and to lead without waiting to be told what to do. And the way we nurture a sense of belonging is actually showing that we really care. This goes beyond empathy. This is really caring. Now, what does that look like? Well, it can be often something very, very simple. During the Iraq War, the people under my command, I would find time to sit down, back against a wall outside somewhere in the desert with some of the most junior people, one-to-one, and just check in with them, just a few minutes. And I mean, I wasn't doing it for any reason other than I wanted to connect with the guy and check that he was okay, check, how's things at home whilst we're out here, And it links into what I talk about being significant. Quite often we think that we have to do big things to make a significant difference, but often it's the smallest thing. It's like a pebble in the pond, and the ripples can go out and go far. And that is what it means to care. We can throw that pebble in the pond, and the ripple effect can go on way, way beyond what we could ever imagine and hope for. And when people feel that they belong, when the people they look towards really cares for them, then it unlocks the potential and the energy and the drive, and they start to source themselves from this side of the equation, from the love side, for something rather than fear of something.
As a leader, are you thinking about the care and safety of your team as you take them from here to there? Is your leadership lifting people up, or are they grounded? I'm not one for heights, but maybe we should be thinking of leadership more like being a pilot or flying. And if you'd like to learn more about this from Peter Docker, or get his book, go to his website, leadingfromthejumpseat.com. And if you want to know more about Chapman & Co. Leadership Institute and what they do and how they can help your company, go to ccoleadership.com. Don't forget to find us and connect on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Barry-Wehmiller.com or trulyhumanleadership.com, where you can find more podcasts, articles, and videos. I'm Brent Stewart. Thanks for listening.